In previous lessons, I've mentioned that something I've picked up on from getting to know a bunch of winners at basically every stake is that they're always looking for a reason to bet, while losing players are constantly in search for reasons to check or fold. And while it's important to have this mindset and use the same approach on every street, I think it's arguably more important to look for ways to stay aggressive on the turn than any other street. Now, understanding the benefits of being aggressive on the turn is easy enough to understand. For example, firing a lot of second barrels makes sense because most opponents' calling ranges on the flop are typically wider than they are on the turn. Plus, the fact that the pots are getting bigger means there's more dead money to capitalize on. But just because there's several good reasons to maintain our aggression on the turn, that doesn't give you a license to double barrel or check raise every time the dealer peels off the turn card. So if we can't pull a Zygmunt and fire away every time we get to the turn, then what determines whether or not we can stay aggressive? Or more specifically, what should we be paying attention to in order to choose the best line? To help you remember what to look for, I decided to borrow a very simple equation from my good friend Beluga Whale, which states that pot equity plus fold equity equals aggression. Seems pretty simple, doesn't it? That's because it is. The combination of fold equity and pot equity is mandatory for us to stay aggressive on the turn. Sometimes you'll have so much pot equity that you'll barely need any fold equity to make staying aggressive profitable. And other times, you'll have so much fold equity that you won't need very much pot equity to make betting profitable. Now, counting your outs and estimating how much pot equity you have is pretty straightforward. But where the real challenge lies for most players is figuring out how to calculate how much fold equity they have against a range of opponents. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to estimate fold equity later on in the slides and in the hand histories following the slides. So I'll save that discussion for later. But for now, just realize that when you find yourself on the turn without any pot equity or fold equity, it's probably a good time to wave the white flag and give up the pot. And while we're on the topic, there's something I'd like to point out before we move on to the next slide. Throughout all of the lessons, I've emphasized over and over again the benefits of semi-bluffing in PLO, and how it rarely makes sense to fire away without any equity. Because after all, this is PLO, which means that you're going to have equity a lot. So why not bluff with some equity instead of zero equity? Well, to give you a visual of the impact that equity has on the profitability of your bluffs, I want you to check out the all-in semi-bluff table at the end of your PLO QuickStats PDF before you go any further in the lesson. On the slide here, it says that you need to memorize it, but I know that's unrealistic. And truthfully, it's not necessary at the moment either. But what I do want is for you to, at the very least, skim over the table and notice the vast difference in profitability that our bets have when we have no equity in the pot and when we have even a seemingly small amount of equity, like 20% or less. What kind of lesson would this be if we didn't learn some new definitions? Now, I want to remind you that these are the definitions that I learned from Tom Chambers' game-changing book titled Advanced PLO Theory. If you're interested in learning more about these concepts, then I definitely recommend heading to www.nutblocker.com for more information. Anyhow, remember for a second that in boarding school, we talked extensively about the differences between static board textures and dynamic board textures. What's convenient is that the same definitions and concepts that we learned in Lesson 8 apply to analyzing turn textures as well. For example, if I say that a flop texture is static, that means that few hands have equity against the current nuts. Likewise, a static turn texture is one where the nuts is unlikely to change on the river, and relatively few hands have good equity against the nuts. The most common example of static turn textures are the boards where the nuts is a flush or a full house, and a small handful of the straight or set boards, like Ace, King, Queen, 7 rainbow, and King, 8, 3 deuce rainbow. Now, we'll go through dynamic turn textures on the next slide, but just realize that since there's only a few hands that are doing well against the current nuts, a polarized range dynamic is created. And since ranges are more polarized on the turn, that means they'll obviously be polarized on the river as well. What this means, or I guess the most important thing you want to take away from this slide, is that bluffing is more powerful on static turns because opponents are more concerned about calling another bet on the river, as well as the potential for drawing terribly against your range. Dynamic turn textures are different in a couple of ways. Dynamic turn textures are where the nuts are likely to change on the river, which means that relatively many hands have good equity against the nuts. Good examples of dynamic turn textures are the boards where the nuts is a set or a straight, and for the most part, These are the types of spots where you see a lot of 60-40 and 66-33% equity matchups when it's heads up. Now, in the last slide, I mentioned that static turn textures typically lead to a two-street polarized range game. Think about what we learned last slide, and then see how it compares to dynamic turn textures, which lead to river ranges that include a lot of drawing and semi-bluffing hands on the turn. On dynamic turn textures, the best strategy usually involves more aggression in the form of semi-bluffing with hands that have reasonable equity against the nuts, or calling in position with the intention of bluffing a completed draw on the river. And not surprisingly, since we learned in the last slide that ranges are more polarized on static turns, it makes sense that ranges on dynamic turns are typically less polarized.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Casino Crime here. Now, if you like this video and you want more, then go ahead and click the subscribe button below right now. And if you want to join me for more of my 6 max success secrets and free video tutorials, just click the link to the right. See you inside the trainings. Good luck.